NAFI would like to thank the sponsors of this week's episode, AOPA and ICOM, for their generous support of the More Right Rudder podcast. ICOM America is a proud supporter of the National Association of Flight Instructors and values its commitment to aviation education in the community. From students to professional pilots and ground crew, ICOM has the right handheld, mobile, or panel mount VHF radio for you. Pilots choose ICOM for features such as Bluetooth, bright displays, and easy-to-use interfaces. Whether it's your first flight or first solo, we appreciate what you do. For stress-free in-flight operations, choose ICOM. Add before flight. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. Today we're joined by Collin McDonald. Collin is a professor at Middle Tennessee State University. He's also an IMP-IA, has owned his own aircraft for 15 years, and just for fun on the side, flies a DC-3 and has his own social media platform handles called The Flying Mechanic. Welcome, Collin.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here today on More Right Rudder.
Thanks. We're happy to have you. So we met Collin at AirVenture. He presented in our professional development center there with a really fascinating presentation on the departure briefing, which I know is one of those things we all know we should do. But especially as instructors, we can get caught up in the moment and sometimes we forget about it. And so Collin has some really great insights into different varieties of the departure briefing, as well as some statistics and things to share on the importance of making sure we get this done.
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. I really started looking at the departure brief after I started doing a little bit more of what I would call a professional flying. When I came on with the DC-3, it was really the first time I had been in a multi-crew environment outside of maybe flight instruction. And I realized that what I had been previously teaching, while it seemed adequate at the time, there was just a shallowness to the type of brief that I was training students to do when compared to what a more commercial type operation would be. And so it started to get me to think about how I approached right before takeoff, and what I did, what I said in that moment. I don't know who said it, but there is an old saying out there, failing to plan is planning to fail. And that's really where this stems from is what am I going to do? Let me have a game plan for a normal and if a abnormal takeoff takes place. So that way I'm anticipating and ready for really those two items to occur. And so
Right.
there's really three phases, I guess you might say, of this. In any given takeoff, there's a passenger brief, a normal brief, and an emergency brief. And those items, I sort of break into those stages, and they occur at different times during the flight. Of the three of these, the one that I feel like we do the best job at training, and I see students when I'm doing flight reviews or when I'm doing just flying out in the general aviation population in general, is the passenger brief. I think we've done a really good job of making sure everyone's aware of not just the regulatory requirements that are from Part 91, no smoking, how to operate seat belts, how to when you should operate or wear your shoulder harness and lap belts, how to operate the doors and emergency exits, things like that, how to operate oxygen in the event of a pressurization failure in a more complex aircraft, things like that. We do a good job of briefing that. And one of the things I like to use is just a card that I can hand to my passengers from an FAA safety training module online. That just goes through all of these items, and it uses the acronym SAFETY to do that. Seat belts and shoulder harnesses, how to work the environmental controls in the event of some type of discomfort, where a fire extinguisher is located. It just goes through a nice organized acronym for my passengers to have something really to look at while I'm doing my run up or taxiing, and as well as for them to review, because there's a good chance they're not going to remember anything I say as we're loading up into the aircraft on how to operate the seatbelt and things like that. So I want something to remind them of kind of the things that we're looking at on the passenger brief side of things.
Yeah, that passenger briefing card is great. I've used that with a lot of students, and I've also even had, like I said, pilots that I'm just doing flight reviews for. Pull it out of their kneeboard, and there it is. It's a great tool. I mean, it's also a great tool. I do a lot of those briefings like before we ever even, I'll get them in the aircraft. But before I even get in, and I've had plenty of times, I used to do a lot of first flights. And so, like, those people who had never been in light GA before. Like I made them physically latch and then unlatch and open the door. Like show me,
Absolutely.
get through that muscle memory, as we're going through that. And the fire extinguisher always, can raise their heart rate a little bit. And we're like, we
Sure.
just need to have it. I'm like, it's there. Don't touch it
Absolutely. Yeah.
unless I
And the
tell you
young,
to.
the younger the passenger, probably the more important it is to have them physically do that,
Hmm.
to make sure they understand how a simple latch functions in an aircraft.
Mhm. And especially if you're in an older aircraft, I used to be flying a 172, it was an N model, and it had the two-piece seat belt where the lap belt was separate from the shoulder harness, and they didn't have any experience. They had only ever experienced, seat belts in modern cars,
Sure.
or commercial aircraft where it's just the lap belt. They didn't, understand, we had to show them how to clip it. And then I always had to make sure to stress, like, if we're getting out of here in a hurry, just take it off in one piece. Don't worry about like neatly unclipping the shoulder harness from the belt.
Absolutely.
And it's like,
Yeah.
just take it off and just like it's your standard, inertial reel, throw it aside and get out. Yeah, a lot of them have never experienced that kind of seatbelt.
Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things I like to do as a CFI, because a lot of times you take a student from nothing to post solo and a safe, competent operator. And that individual, whether or not he or she plans on it, starting out, they're gonna take friends with them.
Hmm.
So well before that check ride takes place, like during solo, I'll start almost simulating being a passenger and
Hmm.
less input from my side and force them to do that student brief to where they're actually walking me through how to unlatch the door, how to unlatch my seatbelts, and it's good practice for them because it's incredibly awkward right off the bat. But eventually they start to realize I completely didn't tell him how to open that door, and he just accidentally popped the door open during a non-critical moment, like
Hmm.
taxiing at an uncontrolled field where nobody else is, because I didn't tell them. And normally it only takes one or two of those little, oh, that could have been bad if it were at a different time, examples or scenarios for them to
Hmm.
realize how important a passenger brief is.
Hmm. And I've always enjoyed having people, the primary applicants, bring passengers along in the later phases of
Right.
training. I've had friends and spouses sit in the back of a 172 while we, it did intercepting and tracking, lots of zigzags over VORs and stuff. But it's boring, largely straight and level
Sure.
flight for the passenger. But it's a great experience for them to actually have to do it to a passenger, under the tutelage. I by then they're pretty far in their training and have done
Right.
things like what you did, with the role playing, but they feel completely different doing it for an actual passenger.
That's right.
And it's always kind of fun. You get 45 minutes into the flight, and you kind of give them a little nudge. I'm like, check on your passenger back there. Are they doing okay? Do they need anything? Half
Right.
the time they've forgotten they're back there.
That's right.
So yeah, because the briefing is just to get you started, but with things especially like that environmental, when pilots or
Mhm.
sorry, rather passengers may start feeling a little queasy or not so well, they're hesitant to speak up sometimes. And so
Absolutely. Yeah.
extended that briefing to make sure you're checking on them every once
Yeah,
in a while
sure.
back there.
So, yeah, basically I just mentioned the minimum things you have to tell them to be
Hmm.
legal. But in reality, and I know you know this, often the scope of what is required for legality may not be the only items we want to discuss. We want to go beyond just legality
Hmm.
to safe and make it not just safe, but enjoyable for our
Right.
passengers. Yeah.
Yeah, so that safety card's a great place. And I liked your idea of having something tactile for those passengers to hold on to, because that can, uh, give them a job essentially. Make
Yeah,
sure you read this and then they have something to focus on.
sure. I mean, that's why the airlines do it. So,
Well, no one pays attention to those anymore, unfortunately. We all have our
Unfortunately,
tablets, but
that's right.
I try to set a good example when I'm on an air carrier, but that's a whole different story.
So the passenger brief in and of itself is really only a third of these types of departure briefs. And what I got most interested in when I started as a professor, sort of doing some research into this initial phase of flight, what caught my eye was I took trends from about the last decade. So from 2012 up till 2023, and I started looking at accidents that occurred in the initial either takeoff and early stage of climb in general aviation. I started trying to identify, okay, what are causing these accidents? According to the statistics that I looked at, there were 1,633 of these accidents, which made up over 10% of all GA accidents.
Hmm.
So a percentage of those unfortunate accidents that were occurring when we go from setting on the ramp to trying to take off and climb. Of those, almost exactly 10% were fatal. 163 fatalities occurred, or I'm sorry, fatal accidents occurred. Um, and that made up 7.5% of all the fatal accidents that
Hmm.
were occurring in the industry. What sparked my interest was that 7.5%, nearly 10% of all fatal accidents were occurring in what normally would be 1 to 2% of a given flight's total time.
Hmm.
So in a very narrow window of the flight, we have enough risk exposure that we are having almost 10% of our fatal accidents occur. And so that's really where this started, kind of an observation from a more professional flight deck to doing research. Is this potentially a problem? Obviously, no fatal accidents is what we're shooting for, but this was one area I thought I would do a little bit of deeper digging into potential things that we could do to minimize the loss of life and equipment in this phase. So one of the ways I did this was looking at what was referred to as the Null report previously. It's now the Rick McSpadden report, but it looks at the accident trends that have taken place over several years, as well as the causes of those accidents. And when looking at the general aviation accident trends for takeoff and climb, it usually hovered around about 125 accidents a year that occurred in that 120 to 125 that occurred during the takeoff and climb phase, with about 20 of those being fatal accidents every year. So I started looking at the types of things that were causing those accidents. By far, the largest percentage was just loss of control. Whether
Hmm.
you're talking about entering a um, IMC scenario to where the pilot just got disoriented and lost control of the aircraft, whether it was wind shear while you're taking off or a gust of wind causing a loss of control, is just a broad category that was loss of control, which holds true for most of the phases of flights. The ones that I noticed where about a third of these accidents were occurring because somebody delayed where they were going to abort an attempted takeoff because of a weight or density altitude issue. The aircraft simply was not configured properly for takeoff, or because of a runway condition that existed, they were unable to take off and it ultimately resulted in an accident. All of those items are really things that a conscious, uh, you know, properly oriented individual who's got a good big picture view of what's going on should recognize as a limitation that is going to cancel the flight or reject a takeoff. Um, and that's where this all comes from, is not doing an effective departure brief is literally allowing, regardless of the level of the individual in the left seat, it's allowing hazards to exist that should have easily been minimized and identified. And so I started looking at who was involved with these accidents, and this ranges everywhere from student pilots all the way up to ATP.
Mhm.
Some of the statistics in the McSpadden report, um, they are, they're taken from a wide viewpoint of, you can't just look at these numbers and get the big picture. This doesn't show me how many flight operations took place for the private pilot, for the commercial pilot, for the ATP pilot, simply just showing percentages of the highest rating for the individual when the accident occurred.
Mhm.
So there is that limitation. We do kind of have to factor in, maybe there are 10 times as many private pilots flying for the given number of flight hours as ATPs. But what I did notice, what was interesting to me, is the shift from a student pilot in which very, very little accidents occurred to the private pilot, which did have more accidents. And while we want them to be minimized in all of these categories, what I think is happening is instructors are doing a good job of training students while we're sitting right there. But I'm almost wondering if just complacency is coming in, or we're just getting used to it, or it's just not as big a deal like it was for me, unfortunately, before I got into a more professional flying to do a really effective departure brief. And so
Mhm.
our students aren't taking that with them once they get their ticket.
Right. Or they, once they start carrying those passengers, or, they get distracted, or, something like, okay, this is my home airport. I've launched off this airport a
Right.
million times. Like, I know it, or yeah. And then once you kind of get out of a habit, it's real easy to get out of a habit and getting
Yeah.
back into it. And also private pilots are amongst that group that's going to have the least amount of contact with some other sort of authority figure. They only need to see a flight instructor every 24 calendar months for their flight review. Someone acting, as a commercial pilot, in a professional pilot capacity is going to be with that crewed environment. They're
Right.
probably, going off to flight safety or some other form of insurance training, likely annually or more frequent than that. And certainly the ATPs, who are still acting in that capacity. So yeah, those private pilots really lack the touch point as
Sure.
well.
Yeah. So I really, from here, I kind of break these briefings down into two different sections. What I'm planning on doing, barring anything going wrong, assuming everything goes correctly, this is what I'm doing. And then separate from that, but just as important, is the emergency brief. What if something does go wrong? So I'll start with what I call the normal departure brief, what I'm anticipating doing given the current conditions, and then we'll go into the emergency brief. So one of the things that I started doing, especially because I was getting into more of a two pilot crew with the DC-3, was who's flying the aircraft. It seems so trite, maybe, or pointless to say, I am doing a normal takeoff. But in reality, there's that positive reinforcement of who has the flight controls. And
Hmm.
that's really what this speaks to. Every time I fly that DC-3, I'm with someone who has almost double the flight time that I do, and countless hours more in the aircraft. So they have way more experience than I do. But I'm just reminding them this is my takeoff. I'm PIC, and often I will invite them at the end of this normal brief to speak into whatever I've said. But I do want to establish that positive flight controls, which was a focus area that the FAA had for quite a few years.
Hmm. Yeah, and
So
really anytime you're flying with a certificated pilot, it's just a good idea to know well, one, who's piloting command, and two, just to have an idea of what they're expecting. It doesn't even need to be a large aircraft like a DC-3. Most of the time I was flying with other flight instructors or commercial pilots or ATP, I was in like a 172 or a 182.
yeah,
And so, we just need to know who's doing what so, we can expect and know what we're
absolutely.
looking at.
Yep. So I would usually follow that up with, and I have a card that I use still to this day to remind me of each of these components. It's not like I just have them memorized, but what type of takeoff am I doing? By this point, I've walked through my checklist because usually I do this holding short of the runway. So I should have already configured the aircraft. But if I'm doing a short field takeoff and I'm planning on using flaps, I'll announce we're going to do a short field takeoff with 10 degrees of flaps, physically touching the flap lever. So I have that tactile confirmation it's where it's supposed to be. If I've got a flaps indication gauge, I'll look at that, verify that it's where it's supposed to be as like a triple redundancy,
Mhm.
just to make sure my configuration is taken care of because a few of those accidents we've already discussed were because of misconfigured aircraft. After that, I brief what I'm taking off on, verifying that I'm at the correct runway, that if it's an intersection takeoff, that I know what my performance data is for whatever amount of runway I have remaining. And regardless, if I'm at the full length of the runway, I'll state where I plan on rotating and where I will abort the aircraft. When I'm doing BFRs, that is probably one of the top things that I see missed
Mhm.
um, on even good departure briefs. People, and I've been guilty of this. So often we assume we are going to fly instead of assuming we're going to have to abort this landing or, excuse me, abort this takeoff. And so we're not anticipating it.
Mhm.
So we allow ourselves to get way down the runway, way too far with way too much energy before we realize something's wrong. There's something maybe just wrong with the engine, and I need to abort. And that can result in way more damage than it would if we had already said, if I get past this point on the runway, I'm going to close the throttle, apply brakes, and stop.
Mhm. And it's amazing how many private pilots out there have never done an aborted takeoff.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
they that may lead to the hesitation having never done it before. And so it's a great exercise to do during training, even just say, we're going to accelerate for 5 seconds, 7 seconds, not something where you're not going to get going very fast,
Sure.
but just, have that experience and you can carry it a little bit further. Or this is a fantastic exercise if you have access to a sim.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You can definitely
These,
you can introduce more things like wind and higher speeds and things like that in a much lower risk environment.
absolutely. So once I briefed my like local environment, runway length, abort point, stuff like that, based on the given density altitude, then I'll make sure that I've reviewed my call outs when it comes to, rotating speed. If I'm single engine, what's my VY, best rate of climb? If I'm short filled, what's VX, my best angle of climb? Obviously, in a multi-engine aircraft, there are a few more speeds we would brief. Um, but really just those critical things that I would want to know instantly, given my current weight and performance of the aircraft, even down to my anticipated climb gradient. Like, how many feet per minute do I think I'm going to be climbing out at based off of that calculation that I've previously done? And that ties into our performance information. Am I at max gross? Am I, pretty light? Whatever I've calculated my weight at, I want to acknowledge both it and my fuel on board. So that way, if something goes wrong, I've got an issue, I get airborne. Mentally, I already know, hey, I've got 3 hours to get this sorted. I have options. Just one more thing to also visually check. Obviously I've already sumped the tanks and looked at them, but if I glance over and my fuel gauge doesn't match what I anticipated, I may want to taxi back and have that addressed. Um, Double check to make sure something's not drastically leaking while I've been
Mhm.
taxiing. So there's a lot of these things that are just like the last triple redundancy before we push out onto the runway.
Yeah, another great reason to enforce doing these briefings.
Yep. And then this might seem like it's more of a instrument pilot type thing, the departure procedure, following up that performance information. But in reality, having a reviewed picture for both operators, like you say, even in a small aircraft, of what we're doing when our wheels leave the ground can help not surprise anyone down the road. Um, because it may be as simple as departing on downwind or making a right turnout after 1,000 feet due to noise abatement. But just briefing what we're going to do once we get airborne can prevent an unnecessary disorientation that could lead to a loss of control when in a critical phase of flight, the other passenger or even, individual who's got a rating setting in there while you're flying with them is confused on what's going on and asks for clarification, when in
Mhm.
reality, we should be focused on flying the aircraft.
Yeah, that's not the time for questions.
Absolutely. No, it's critical phase. So then adverse winds, whatever's going on, whether that's a crosswind, wake turbulence, especially, departing
Mhm.
aircraft. If a lot of grass strips, especially, are one way in, one way out, if there's any
Mhm.
tailwind component that you need to make sure you've acknowledged or factored in, that's the very last thing I do. And I mean, I've got literally hundreds of hours in the aircraft that I usually and routinely fly, and I still orally brief a crosswind takeoff every time because it's a tailwheel aircraft. I physically put my inputs in. The wind is coming from the left. It might seem redundant, but it's also safe. So that's why I do
Right.
it to remind myself.
And it's keeping yourself in the habit. And,
Absolutely.
and if even when you are solo, one, you're more likely to catch it yourself if you say it out loud and it doesn't sound quite right. But even just in the habit for when you are flying with a crew or even a passenger might catch when you say, "Oh, I'm going to do this to the left," and then you point to the right or something is silly like that. Those human errors we all make. Um, and so it's just a great practice for keeping the habit and communication.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the last thing that I always do on this part of the brief, because I'm about to launch into what happens if I lose my engine,
Hmm.
is I always invite, and even if it's a passenger, and normally passengers look at me, not dumbfounded, but they just look at me amazed that I would ask this. But I ask for comments, questions, suggestions, because maybe I've said something that either doesn't make sense to them, or especially if it's a fellow aviator who has a license, I want to get their input. They just observed something that I haven't seen a lot of in my GA flying. I'm seeing it more and more, fortunately, but I'm hopefully instilling in others, hey, I'm planning on doing this. I'm trying to be really thorough, but I respect the training you've gone through, and I want you to look at what I'm doing and critically evaluate what's going on. Like, do you have any suggestions, ideas? Have I forgotten something? Does something
Hmm.
not look the way that I've presented it in this briefing?
Hmm.
So immediately following up my normal brief, what I typically will do is roll straight into the post any comments or questions emergency brief. So what happens if I don't successfully take off? And I kind of break these up into three different phases of the takeoff. I know a lot of people are doing this nowadays. But on top of making sure I've verbalized who is the pilot in command of the aircraft, I'll brief those three components. Now, what's interesting about this, especially if I'm flying someone else's aircraft, like if I am, the other day I flew with a buddy in a Mooney, and it was the first time I'd been in a Mooney in a very long time. I was left seat. He was basically doing a not transition course for me, but letting me get back into the aircraft.
Hmm.
During my departure brief, instead of saying, if an emergency occurs, I am going to, I invited him to take the flight controls. Said, in the
Hmm.
event of emergency, this is your aircraft. You're familiar with its performance. I will give you the flight controls if you request them, and allow you to do what you see fit and what the aircraft is capable of.
Hmm.
So this is one of those stages where it's not just saying I've got the flight controls again. It may be best to say, this is your airplane. You know it. Something goes wrong, I want you to take it, and I will support you however I can.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's a great tool for flight instructors to use because we're commonly in the same, training aircraft or types of training aircraft repeatedly. And if we're doing a flight review for a private pilot with maybe a couple hundred hours, or maybe it's their first flight review, you definitely are more capable of handling the aircraft in an
Right.
emergency, especially if that pilot doesn't fly regularly. Of course, there are some private pilots who go out there and fly all the time and are super proficient. But there are those, kind of the weekend warriors doing your 40-ish so hours a year.
Right.
Yeah, in an event of a real emergency, it may be better to transfer those controls to the flight instructor. And so having that tool in your belt to discuss with the pilot's great.
Absolutely. And so it would look different if you gave them controls for the emergency. You'd have them brief it honestly at that point.
Hmm.
But if it were me and I'm planning on handling or dealing with whatever arises, I would brief three different phases. The first one being if I'm still on the runway, and this is probably the simplest of all three. Still on the runway, I've got runway remaining, I've not rotated yet, and I lose an engine, blow a tire, something just doesn't feel right even. I don't have enough power
Yeah,
on
annunciator illumination, anything.
anything. This one's the simplest. Closed throttle, apply brakes. Now, usually, most aircraft, even general aviation aircraft, are in their operating handbook or flight manual, will have what we call immediate action items, things that you
Mhm.
just instantly need to know before even pulling a checklist out. And that's normally the simplest in this phase. It's normally closed throttle, apply brakes. Sometimes they'll even say pull mixture, but in reality, you just want to stop the aircraft.
Mhm.
This is where that abort point comes in. That's an automatic, I'm going to abort, and it's the exact same thing. Close throttle, apply brakes. Then the transition point is if I'm off the runway, and really in ground roll, I include if I'm off the runway, but I have runway remaining. I am landing straight ahead, no option. Just if I'm 20 feet off the ground, I'm closing throttles, might add flaps, depending on the scenario, the runway I'm
Mhm.
taking out of, because every brief looks different, and landing straight ahead. The next real transition is when I'm at a safe altitude um, to maneuver around. So if I'm between taking off and up to whatever 600 feet, 700 feet, whatever I've determined is a safe altitude for me to start attempting either returning to the airport or maneuvering aggressively left or right,
Mhm.
below that altitude, I am going to plan to stay within 15 degrees of that runway heading if I can. And I already need to know where I'm going. For me, a lot of times this looks like pulling out Google Map and just looking what's around this airport. And if you fly in and out of it consistently, you're already going to know.
Mhm.
But it may be more beneficial on takeoff to already know I only have one option, and it's 10 degrees off to the right. It's a field, or a really unfortunate scenario, maybe all there is a road or something that
Mhm.
you need to acknowledge.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's what one of the runways I take off. There's a quarry off the end of it. I mean, it's several
yeah,
hundred feet deep. It's a hole in the ground made out of rocks. And so your options are the industrial park or the Wendy's drive-through.
yeah,
So
and
I choose the industrial park. There's a field beyond it if I'm lucky.
yeah,
But yeah, but Google Maps is a great tool for assessing that.
yeah, and sometimes that takes experience to learn what that safe altitude is.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a lot of great information out there now, thanks to Mr. Barry and a lot of other individuals who've done research on the return to the airport, which unfortunately gets dubbed the impossible turn. But there's
Hmm.
a lot of ways you can determine what that safe altitude is that really are beyond the scope of just talking about it in
Hmm.
this discussion. So if you're above it, you've got more flexibility. You can potentially return to the airport. If you've got multiple runways, maybe a crossing runway, that can be an option as well. And something that was really challenging as a mentality for me as an operator to get over was not just keeping the aircraft in one piece, but being able to be really recovered in the event of an unfortunate loss of
Hmm.
the aircraft. It's not just about bringing the aircraft home, it's about making sure we can walk away from it. And that's where when you don't have a lot of good options, like
Hmm.
a terrain or a wooded forest area, it might be better to acknowledge I've got to put the aircraft down on that road. I know there's trees on either side of it. I'm probably going to ding or dent something up, but I'll be very accessible. Somebody's going to notice that the aircraft is down, and I'm not going to be by myself, maybe hanging out in the middle of a forest somewhere. Um, that's something you have to factor in when you're making these decisions of where you're going to go or if you're going to come back.
Hmm. Yeah, and one thing we always briefed when we were training applicants with this is people get so focused on that 180-degree turn back to the runway, but that's of course a bit more than a 180-degree turn. That's a
Sure.
bit more maneuvering. So even if you have to hit a parallel taxiway,
Yep.
it's not ideal. But if there's no traffic, you might not have the energy for that additional maneuvering or even the grass inside the fence.
Right.
The if you're at an airport with, an ARF station, they're going to get to you a lot faster anywhere inside the fence than
That's
than
right.
outside of it. You don't necessarily need a hard surface. It, be ideal, but
Yeah.
this is an emergency.
And a lot of those airports that have that are also going to have a lot of either residential areas around them or industrial areas. You're talking about a bigger city that's got a larger airport. So there may not be good options, outside of that fence that can be accessed. So it's the emergency brief sounds really vague the way I'm talking about it, but it's just because it can be so tailored to not just an airport, not just an aircraft, but to the individual flying it.
Hmm.
We will all have different altitudes given our experience for that. And that's why this is so important.
Hmm.
Today, at this time, the wind is coming from this direction. So I want to turn into it to try to, maximize my performance. All of this. That's why this is, if I leave and go to a new airport, I do a new departure brief, new
Hmm.
environment, new brief. Um, but those are really the three areas: the ground roll, below a certain safe altitude, and above it. In addition to that, once I've got those three phases briefed, I remind myself what is maneuvering speed given my current weight, because it will
Hmm.
fluctuate given your the weight of the aircraft. So I'll brief what that is. If I'm single engine, same thing, or I'm sorry, if I'm multi-engine, same thing with my single engine best rate of climb speed, whether or not that's going to have a performance index or it's going to be a minimum descent. All of that I brief as a critical airspeed. Landing options I've already kind of discussed, and then evacuation procedures. This can be as much a reminder for me as it can be a last second review if I've got passengers with me as well. Right before we launch, you know, walking through this last thing that we can egress through the doors. If they're damaged, we can go through the baggage door. If it's, blocked, we can kick out the windshield possibly. Just what are my options? What are my plans? Make sure I have at least
Hmm.
talked about it and I've not failed to plan. So that way I'm not planning to fail.
Right. And an important part of that is telling the passengers where to go. I mean, not just how
Exactly.
to get out, but I tended to brief people to, head towards the back of the aircraft and we would meet behind it. If we assuming we could, we're in a field or something, we can
Right.
egress, all the hot bits with fuel are in the front. So
Sure. Yeah.
I always brief people, we'll meet at the back of the aircraft, just get out and get behind it. And,
Yeah.
conveniently I was flying a lot of Cessnas, so the door kind of blocks your access. You're kind of naturally steered that
Sure.
direction, and but that's what I did.
Yeah, I think a very common one I've heard is meet 150 feet behind the aircraft. And if I can't get out, and there's problems, call for help,
Hmm.
and don't risk coming back for me. That sort of thing, stuff you have to really think about.
Hmm.
But, especially if this is the first time you've kind of done one of these, it takes some practice. It's like riding a bike. Like you have to get
Hmm.
used to doing a departure brief. So where I teach at MTSU, we actually in our checklist have really all three of these briefings laid out: passenger brief, the takeoff brief, and the emergency brief, just so that way our students are conscious and aware of kind of like almost like a checklist. This
Hmm.
is what you need to talk about right before you take off. And we do require or encourage students to do this every time they're at a new environment, whether that's a new airport, winds have changed, the runway flipped. Just do a new briefing. Make sure that we've taken care of everything. And just because a change has occurred, we've not allowed a hazard to come into our flying.
Yeah, that right back to basics, your law of primacy or recency, what you've heard most recently, or if you have to change it, or what you heard first is what your brain's going to go to. So hopefully recency
Absolutely.
is that, and so you're just priming your brain in the way it's kind of designed to be used with that.
Yeah. So when it comes to me as an individual doing this, to this day, I still do this to a degree, but I spent a month straight every day briefing one of these just to get used to it, using
Mhm.
the checklist because it's kind of awkward. It's a little bit bulky to do it. By the time you're an instructor, hopefully you're used to hearing your own voice in the cockpit, and that's not the issue. But for private students, if there's somebody listening that's that you are an earlier adopter of this, before your CFI, you're already listening to these type of things. You need to be practicing this so that way you're used to the flow, the natural
Mhm.
flow of one of these. I do this every time I go up, regardless if I've got passengers or if I'm by myself. I still orally brief my normal and emergency takeoffs, do a full brief every time a change occurs, like a new airport or maybe a wind shift to a new runway. Make sure that you're using the tactile touch of if you're doing a short fill with flaps, physically touch to make sure that flap
Mhm.
handle's in the right spot. Physically walk through. If your immediate action item is to try to restart the engine, physically touch those items to remind you muscle memory of where they're located. And then one of the things that I've really started doing lately was thinking about who's in the aircraft with me and maybe modifying how I say these things. If I've got a 8-year old, my daughter, if she's with me, I might modify some of the way I say this just to
Mhm.
alleviate her potential anxiety. If it's the very first time she's flown with me and it's a two-seat aircraft, I am the only one in there with her. I might modify how I word some of this stuff just because she's in there. If it's ATP captain, I'm going to obviously use technical terminology and invite them to critique what I'm doing. So
Mhm.
you just really have to consider who's in the aircraft and not just make it safe, but potentially beneficial for you and definitely beneficial for them.
Right. And I would, when I was doing a lot of these first flights, I would kind of preface it with, these scenarios are rare, but we're going to talk about this anyways, just so we're prepared. We're not
Absolutely.
expecting this to happen, but we need to know what to do just
Yeah.
in case.
And that's
And
it.
so
Yep.
and they were typically understanding of that because if you just launch into, here's all the things that could happen, the engine fails and, we got the quarry off the end of the runway and all this stuff, they can get deer in the headlights real quick. And then, you're already at the hold short line, like ready to go now. They're like, no.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
It really
uh,
does help to, put them at ease and just say, look, we're not planning on this to occur. If it does, that's why I'm reviewing it. I want it to be fresh and on my mind.
mhm.
So that's really where the main thing that I would do modification would be is in that right there.
Yeah. All right. So since we've got through the bulk of our material here, let's go ahead. Would you mind giving us an example of one of your briefings?
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the one that I have here is just a generic one for um, an aircraft that I would fly, and it's for a specific runway. Obviously, you modify this to what you have. This is just an example of how the flow
Mhm.
might go. Um, I would start with just by saying, okay, I'm going to do my normal departure brief. I'm going to complete a short field takeoff using 10 degrees of flaps, physically touching that flap handle. We're departing runway 18, which is 5,000 feet long. VR is 50. VX will be 58, and VY is 65. The current aircraft weight in this example is 2,300 pounds, and it's going to require 1,180 feet, given our current density altitude, to get airborne, and 1,500 feet to clear a simulated 50-foot obstacle. We're topped off with 4 hours of fuel on board. After takeoff, we'll make a left crosswind while climbing and depart north off the downwind. Wind is 230 at 5, giving us a slight right crosswind. So I'm going to have ailerons into the wind and take it out as I get more dynamic airflow across the surface. Questions, comments, suggestion. Now, the one thing that is left out on this would be the abort point for the
Mhm.
aircraft. In my scenario that I've got here, if I'm halfway down the runway, that's a good indication something's wrong. If I was only supposed to take 1,100 feet, and I'm 2,500 feet down the runway, that's where my abort point would be for this scenario. And that's what it is coming out of Lebanon, which is where I would be using this for. I'm
Mhm.
also simulating a short field takeoff. So that's something to acknowledge as well.
Mhm.
But that's an example of a normal brief that I then invite feedback on.
Yeah, and that abort point is something to critically think about because I've heard a lot of people use like, oh, the halfway point on the runway. Like, well, when I was doing a Part 61 instruction after I left the university, the primary runway at the airport I was at was 9,000 feet. So,
Mm,
if I, that so
sure.
my halfway point was longer than most, or at least a good chunk of the runways that people are using for training. So,
Absolutely.
I always prefer to think of it as a proportion of my planned takeoff roll. So, if you're not at a certain percentage of your airspeed by a certain percentage of your planned takeoff roll, to think about
Oh, that's
aborting
good.
then. And then having some sort of, if at all possible, a little fixture along the side of the runway. Maybe that's a distance remaining sign or a VOR or a taxiway. This is
Sure.
another place where Google Earth is a really great tool, because it has that measurement tool, or
Mm.
Google Maps rather, has that measurement tool, so you can kind of get an idea. I mean, that's kind of deep in the weeds planning. You may not have opportunity for that at everything, but if you have, like we all kind of have our handful of airports that we're at pretty regularly, it's a good way to establish where that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that what using airspeed as a reference is really important when it comes to really short runways,
Hmm.
because that really short runway will you if you eat up half of it, you may have so much energy that it takes quite a bit of braking to slow down. So
Hmm.
like 40 knots by the displaced threshold or something might be really important when you're doing that.
Yeah, there's a little airport around here that's it's a pretty significant slope, and it's 1,800 feet. So,
Yeah,
if you're on the downhill side, and you've got to abort, like you got to make that decision early because you're not going to have a lot of room. Plus, it's downhill, and
sure.
so all those things to think about. And
Yeah.
we'll save the discussion on digging into the chart supplement. Sorry, my brain still goes AFD, and all those
I
weeds for
grew up with
another
an
time.
AFD, yeah.
I'm like the little, it's still in my brain. See the picture of the little green
Yeah.
book, and they've been gone for how long? And all right, well, Colin, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share these insights with us. This is fantastic for all flight instructors and pilots, and it'll even be a great tool as they plan to grow their career, in addition to passing it along to their learners.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah and Nafi, for inviting me on to talk about what I think is just another really important thing for us to consider.
All right, thank you. Listeners to the More Right Rudder podcast can get $10 off their NAFI membership. Use the code POD49, POD49, at checkout at nafinet.org. This code is good for both new and renewal memberships.